everyone, welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, a new era for Japan's defense policy. Thousands protest in Tokyo as controversial security laws goes into effect. What will it mean for Abe's government and the country's position in the region? And fresh real estate regulations in China. The government is moving to cool the country's real estate market after a surge in property prices has raised the fears of a bubble. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's ambitiously blueprinted security laws took effect on Tuesday, marking an enormous shift in Japan's defense policy after 7 decades of pacifism. The controversial laws have ordered Japan's self-defense forces to stand ready to participate in armed conflicts overseas. Japan's neighbors, including China, are concerned about what that means for the region. We'll discuss the potential impact of the new security laws, but first, take a look at this.
Protests are heating up once again in Japan. People are currently gathering in front of the Japanese Diet Building, demanding Shinzo Abe's resignation and the withdrawal of his security agenda. Protests across Japan have been going on for weeks and are likely to continue until the upper house election this summer.
No matter what lists of reasons Mr. Abe gave or conditions that he promised in exercising the collective self-defense, it means the same thing. Japan is readying itself to take arms and become a country that will participate in war.
Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is under pressure after 2 Japanese opposition parties merged 2 days ago. And his approval ratings have fallen dramatically after the Abe-led ruling coalition pushed the controversial bills through Parliament last year. In September, the legislation was enacted amid widespread public opposition due to its unconstitutionality. The Japanese war-renouncing constitution banned the country's military from exercising the right to collective defense. But on Monday, Japan switched on a radar station on Yonaguni Island in Okinawa Prefecture, about 150 kilometers from China's Diaoyu Islands.
We hope that Japanese side would draw lessons from history, stick to the path of peaceful development, handle its military and security policies prudently, and do more to enhance mutual trust with neighboring countries so as to contribute to peace and stability in the region.
Other neighboring nations have also expressed discomfort with the laws, arguing that they erode trust within the region.
In
regard to Japan's security laws that took effect today, the South Korean government has been maintaining the stance that Japan's defense and security policies should adhere to the spirit of pacifist laws and move towards a direction that contributes to the region's peace and stability in a transparent way. In this respect, we plan to monitor Japan's security policy directions from now.
The new security legislation also empowers Japan to promote weapons assistance and defense technology transfer to regional countries close with Japan and the United States, which has raised fears in China that the region's geopolitical balance will be harmed.
And for more discussion of Japan's new security law, we're joined here in the Beijing studio by 2 Chinese panelists. First of all, Mr. Teng Jianqun, who is the director for arms control at the China Institute of International Studies, with us. Welcome to our program, Mr. Teng. Joining us also in the studio, Mr. Yang Bojiang, who is the deputy director at the Institute of Japan Studies from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome to our program as well, Mr. Yang. Joining us also from Tokyo, we're having Professor Takasato Watanabe from Doshisha University. Professor Watanabe, welcome. Gentlemen, the very first question I have for you, of course, is what does it mean, the enactment of the so-called new security law, particularly to neighbors like China? Mr. Yang, briefly.
Yeah, briefly, I think it means a lot for Japan to make the so-called new security law in effect. Generally speaking, I think it means Japan does pose new uncertainty to the regional stability in Asia-Pacific region. And because so far, Japanese government basically, from the end of the World War II, and has been keeping the so-called peaceful development line, but now it changed its basic line to some uncertain line from now on. So what I'm worried the most is whether Japan the next step is going to take. So yeah, what's the impact on the regional security stability?
Interestingly said, Mr. Tang, one of the things people are extremely concerned about is the vagueness in the interpretation of this new law, security law, because at the very beginning it was all pacifist constitution, and therefore you don't need to have any new interpretation. But now term being used, and Japan could even send the troops abroad under certain circumstances, yet protocols, conditions, the scales, all of these are vague, and therefore up to interpretation of whoever is in power. That's where the danger is, isn't it?
Generally speaking, I think it will take a little while for people, for nations in this region to understand what the real implication of such a step taken by Shinzo Abe. And I'm sure this is really a challenge for the regional peace and stability, as Mr. Yang just mentioned. I think for at least 7 decades, the pacifist constitution of Japan has already prevented, many involvement of the young generation, young men of Japan be involved in the conflict or war, led by the United States in this region. So I think this might be bad news for the public, not only for the politicians. It's actually the public worried a lot about this step.
Professor Watanabe, you know this better than any of us. What exactly is the meaning of the new security law, as we say, particularly regarding Japan could now send troops overseas? It could also come to the rescue of the so-called allies or friendly nations if the latter were under armed attack from a third party. What would all of these exactly mean for Japan's overall scale and roles of participation in armed conflicts internationally?
About this, first of all, I want to say that those security-related bills have nothing beneficial to the Japanese people and also to the neighboring nations, because there are 2 reasons for that. The first one is that United States want to do his own issues, his own, everything military affairs, and they want to have Japan pay for the costs on the basis of the wish of the United States. And also, United States can get a better position when he wants to talk with China, having the support of South Korea and also India or Vietnam, Philippines. When we talk about this security-related bills, it is not only on the written words on the laws, but also why they came into practice.
Right.
Because
Professor Watanabe, I understand what you're talking about, mainly the geopolitical reasons behind the coming into life, this new security law and its possible impact on the geopolitics in the Asia-Pacific region. Having said that, though, I want to go back to the original question. What exactly is your interpretation of what we have talked about, which is the vagueness of the new security law? How much space does it really give at this moment, the so-called the ones in power in Japan, to use this law and exercise to what extent a possible military action coming from Japan? What would that mean for Japan's neighbors?
for that, you see, main target is China, which should be considered by Japanese military powers, generation, and industries, and also by the United States. China is hypothetical enemy. And also, for Mr. Abe, China and South Korea are the countries and the people who should not appear so often in the textbooks relating to the historical matters. Mr. Abe is so afraid of those things, so he wants to make Japanese people forget anything bad when Japanese military occupation was realized 70 years ago.
Professor
So
Watanabe,
these are very much complex.
I have to go back to the question,
Yes,
really, because once again, what you just explained might be the political intention, as you see it, behind the Prime Minister Abe's political calculation, besides with the change of the new security law. But I really want from you at this moment is your interpretation of exactly the wordings of this new security law, and what would that really mean for Japan's cabinet, its capability of exercising military power in the neighborhood and also in other parts of the world. Help us to understand the exact scale, intensity, the kinds of political procedures that the cabinet has to go through in order to use very well, as they see it, this new security law.
At present, practically, there's not so big possibility for the Japanese people in the military forces, defense forces, would go to outer parts of Japan, but this year, 47 graduates of the Japan Defense University, it is 11% of all the graduates, they denied to work or to be employed in the self-defense forces, saying that we should not fight representing the benefits of the United States or representing the military industries. So those experts who were considered to be the fighters in the battlefield in this, you see, related bills, they know what will happen
Right.
after 1 or 2 years of time when we have the security problems in the Middle East.
Okay.
So
One
this is
can-
very dangerous.
Yeah, one can probably tell quite clearly the political stance of Professor Watanabe in Japan. Of course, we understand there's very strong opposition inside the Japanese society, just as many feel the same way with Professor Watanabe. Having said that, though, I want to come back to you because Professor Watanabe said this is a very dangerous first step. The significance is this is only the beginning of the danger. So let's talk about what the danger could be. Not long ago, 2 days ago, in fact, we've already heard the news that Japan started the radar system on an island at 150 kilometers away from the Diaoyu Island, which is the island in dispute between China and Japan. And the danger is whether the two countries would have armed conflicts or any of the same nature, whatever scale we are talking about, as a result of the different identities. So, Mr. Tang, how much do you think this new security law would enable the Japanese cabinet and administration to exercise what they consider as so-called defense of the national sovereignty? If that is the case, how much danger are we seeing from the Chinese side of conflict possibilities in these areas?
Let's discuss this question from the historical approach. If we look at the history in the recent 100 years, Japan launched at least 5 or 4 wars in this region against Russia, against the United States, against China. And this is history. We should learn lessons from the history. And if we look at the preparation of the Japanese military in recent years, we can find very specific target at this time. That means the Japanese, all the preparation, all the military preparation by Japan is targeted at China, including your mentioned just now the deployment of a radar system and also the troops in the island, very close to Diaoyu Islands. So this is a very dangerous step taken by Japanese government, and of course China will give very positive response and give a very good preparation for any provocation from the Japanese side.
But then, just to be fair, because we don't have the specific right wingers from Japan. So let me ask this question just for fairness. Mr. Yang, Japan has been arguing, well, if China has been doing what they consider as self-defense, Japan should also has the right for its own self-defense, including putting on the radar system, including, let's just say, sending the Japanese troops overseas in order to protect its own sovereignty and so-called security. What do you think?
Yeah, I think to some extent Japan remains as a unique state even today because of the history not so far ago, the Second World history, what he did during that war time, and plus one very key significant factor, which is the Shinzo Abe cabinet has been denying the history. So that double made
in the humanity textbooks, for
that's
example.
Right, that's right. May I add something to what Mr. Teng mentioned? And actually, the law we are discussing about the new security law, right? But actually, in Japanese domestic law, the new security law is not directly connected with Sino-Japanese territorial disputes, because even without the law, the inauguration of the law, Japan can do such things. I mean, to start the radar on the Yonaguchi Island and something like that, because the key or the central piece of the new law is one wording. It's the right to collective self-defense. Yeah, it's trilateral, not trilateral, but a multilateral relationship, or trilateral, something like that. Yeah.
And then your point about what would that necessarily mean for the neighborhood security, for example, conflicts with China, because it could also be involving a third party.
That's right. Yeah. That's
Even
what
though
I mean.
it is not directly bilateral.
That's what I mean. And actually, I think what you both mentioned is very interesting things, as well as the ambiguity, the strategic ambiguity, because the key word, Japan will be, based on the law, Japan will be able to defend other countries which has close relationship with Japan. Of course, the United States is one of them because they are allies with each other. But besides United States, there are some other countries. But what are the other countries? Which countries are the others? Japan is the only one who will be able to define. So what Abe Shinzo wants to do is to control such a political or strategic control, is something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's one significant point. Another significant point is, what would this so-called new enactment of the law, security law, mean for Japanese politics? We understand that when the security law was passed by the Japanese Congress, so the so-called Diet, it was because the LDP is having full control of the parliament inside Japan. But now things have changed. Professor Watanabe, the new opposition party was formed just days ago, and it's combining some of the previous so-called DPJ and also the New Innovation Party in Japan, forming the so-called Democratic Party of Japan. How much rivaling forces do you think and strength this new opposition party has vis-a-vis the controlling ruling party, LDP?
Mr. Okada, new leader, former leader of the Democratic Party of Japan, said, first of all, we want to check the politics of Mr. Abe. Mr. Abe should retire from the politics of Japan. But they have only 159 seats in the Diet. So it is not so easy. However, Prime Minister Abe wants to take the notice of the people toward the colorful, our ideas say, the more difficult, complicated matters like military fields. So politics social welfare problems, education problems are very seriously ill in Japan now. But Mr. Abe wants to erase everything on those things and take the military actions and cooperation with the United States. So
All right.
Mr. Abe is very complicated and very cunning.
I see what your point is. Coming back to you, Mr. Yang, two things. One is what Professor Watanabe mentioned about the domestic issues, mainly social issues, whether or economic issues, whether being taken care of. The Abenomics, once being claimed by the Japanese Prime Minister as one with the 3 miracle arrows, and now become 3 miracle eras. On the other hand, we also see issues like daycare, which the opposition party has been talking a lot these days, has not been done well, together with some of the other social welfare issues by the Abe administration. How much will the Japanese politics, rather publics, care about these issues vis-a-vis, let's just say, national interest issues as being portrayed by the Abe administration?
I think it's very obvious that the public in Japanese society, they pay much more attention to their everyday life in comparison with the so-called security strategy or security policy. We can understand that point from a lot of various of censuses. So many censuses have been there. And nevertheless, may I add just one sentence. I don't think the new established the so-called New Democratic Party can play a very significant role to change the structure, the political structure in Japan, because the start point for the two parties to get united with each other is to survive. So basically, the characteristic of the union, of the combination, is defensive, not aggressive.
To survive, not necessarily to challenge. Probably that is the status of the so-called new opposition party right now. But the election is upcoming in July, very soon. How much will all of these issues mixed up and eventually present to the Japanese public? What would that eventually mean for the Abe administration and the LDP locally, nationally?
If we look at the recent 2 decades of development in the Japanese politics, you can find a very specific feature of the politics in that country. For example, each prime minister, when he came into the office, I think the #1 job is to mobilize the support from the public by manipulating, for example, China threat and other issues, domestic issues and international issues. So this is actually very short-sighted policy. So for Shinzo Abe, his economic policy, his security policy actually, or for the mobilization of the support for his power. And the coming election in the Dai, I'm sure Shinzo Abe will pay much attention and attach great importance to such a campaign for his power, to consolidate his power in the country.
Well, those are, of course, the very important trends politically to watch in Japan, and that would mean a lot for Japan's neighbors, not only now, but also for the near and midterm future. Thank you so much, gentlemen, the 3 of you, for joining us. Teng Jianchun, Yang Bojiang, and Professor Takasato Watanabe from Japan. Really appreciate it, gentlemen, for being with us.
Thank you.
Stay with us here on World Insight. We've got our final segment coming right up. New real estate regulations in China. In an attempt to stabilize the country's soaring real estate market, the government is making it tougher for Chinese to buy property. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. After 2 months of soaring housing prices, the Shanghai and Shenzhen governments are tightening restrictions in an attempt to cool the market. Meanwhile, other cities are also enacting policies in China to tackle this issue. Some people are optimistic about the restrictions, but others have raised concerns. Will the regulations be effective? Before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at this.
China's toughest ever home buying restrictions. New regulations on real estate purchases in China's largest cities took effect last Friday. Shanghai has increased down payment requirements for second apartments to 50% of the buying price, up from 30% last year. Residents from different provinces now have to pay social insurance for 5 consecutive years in order to qualify to buy a home. And down payment loans are now prohibited. Meanwhile, Shenzhen has banned residents from buying more than 2 apartments. And residents from different provinces are only allowed 1 apartment after paying social insurance for 3 consecutive years. And there are more policies on the way to regulate China's housing market.
We put forward policies cracking down on illegal real estate agents, including the third-party monitoring system for the second-hand house transfer capital and a law enforcement power to regulate real estate companies and agents on their intentional speculation of the house price and false advertisement.
But some people are skeptical of the new regulations.
I think the effectiveness of the regulations will be minor, and I don't think there is any more room for the government to further tighten the market.
Chinese property prices have increased by a lot this year. New home prices soared 57.8% year-on-year in the southern city of Shenzhen. Shanghai registered a 25.1% and Beijing a 14.2% increase from 2015.
Last June, my colleague bought a suite, which has now gone up to 500 million. How many years would you have to work in order to afford this? This applies a lot of psychological pressure. If you didn't buy back then, you might have to work for more than 30 years to be able to afford an apartment.
While first-tier cities are struggling to cool the overheated housing market, lower-tier cities are still facing the challenge of destocking. Data shows that in February, the commercial housing sales ratio of third and fourth-tier cities was 32.07, far more than the reasonable ratio of 15. The new restrictions are expected to curb irrational investment in the property market, but critics say that more may be required to stabilize the market.
And for more on China's real estate market, all the latest development in Beijing studio, we are joined by Professor Liu Baocheng, who is Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, Professor Liu. Meanwhile, joining us from Washington, D.C. in the U.S., we are having Tamin Bayoumi, who is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Welcome as well, Mr. Bayoumi. First of all, Professor Liu.
Thank you. Yes.
How come overnight real estate sector, a sector that has been considered as the place where destock should be done, now become the darling of the market?
Well,
help us to explain this, please.
Well, there are several tiers of demand for this. One is the real need is still there because of the immigration is still going on in a very rapid pace due to the urbanization process. And particularly if you see Shenzhen, actually 70% of the new home buyers are really the immigrants into the cities. And in Beijing, the number is still is also on increasing 40%. And second is that people have a firm belief, despite the government efforts to direct them to the third-tier cities and fourth-tier cities for home purchase, they believe that the first-tier city, particularly the major city, they will never fall on the price. So that's a safe bet. And third reason is that many people got their fingers burned over the stock, and now they have the remnant money and they want to place it in the safe haven. So real estate investment is always the safe haven.
All right. Well, Mr. Bayoumi, of course, observing from Washington with a distance, what do you make of this very interesting and very China-unique phenomenon?
Well, you know, I don't think it's time to quite hit the panic button yet. If you look overall for 100 cities, you know, house prices are going up at 6%. As you say, they're going up very fast in some of the larger cities and actually falling in some of the smaller and second and third tier cities. It's a phenomenon that we sometimes see. I think it bears watching because very often things which start in the mega cities then move on to other places. But at present, I'm not sure that, you know, as I say, we have to start panicking too much.
All right. As you said, both of you, there are extremes inside China's real estate market. On the one hand, there are tons of unsold houses in lower tier cities, so-called the third tier, fourth tier. But on the other hand, the housing prices rose sharply in big cities or the so-called mega cities. According to National Bureau of Statistics from China, in February, the housing prices of 37 out of the 70 large and medium-sized cities in China went down, while the property prices of 32 cities went up, and the price of one city stayed unchanged. Among the cities, Shenzhen boasts the highest amount of increase, 57% increase, and the highest amount of decrease was 3.9%. This is really a very different market that we are talking about, two extremes. Professor Liu, what would this mean necessarily eventually for China's real estate sector?
Well, I think it's the inevitable polarization among the Chinese economic distribution, also in the demographic distribution. If you can see that in northeastern Shenyang, they even encourage college students to have zero down payment to buy houses. And I also made a comparison that in Beijing, the house over the past 10 years has increased on a yearly basis 80%, and in Xi'an they only increased by a margin of less than 10%. So this polarization is not really welcome by the Chinese government. So therefore, both at the central level and local level, they fiddle a lot of policies and with high frequency in terms of
we
changes.
heard about those similar policies, as you mentioned, in the city of Shenzhen, in the city of Shanghai, and we see also possibly in other mega cities. But the question is, will these policies necessarily going to work? Will they cool down the prices of the real estate market inside these mega cities, or, you know, the so-called bubble, or at least the prices are guaranteed to rise?
Well, ever since 3 years ago, the government focus was really there to bring down the housing prices across China, because that's something that they have a commitment with the people to have more of affordable housing by the stamping out speculation, also by providing more affordable houses. And right now, the affordable house is really completed by the actually the end of last year, and so and now they try to encourage, you know, the destocking in the say low tier cities. So but right now the measure is not really very effective so far.
Mr. Tayumi, what is your observation? Because overall, what we are talking about are two issues, fundamental issues. One is what to do with an overheating sector, which is the real estate sector, which is also not a rising sector, but rather a falling sector if China really wants to change its structure of the economy. On the other hand, there's also the critical issue of the relations between the roles of the government and the market itself in terms of deciding what's going to be the future of China's real estate sector as well. So you got two very fundamental questions all woven into the price hikes that we've seen in some megacities, and also the price falls of many of those overstocks of housing inside third and fourth tier cities. So Mr. Tayumi, what do you make of all of this?
Well, I think it's a sort of complex problem because you have, as you say, two problems. What we do know from the international evidence is that we can control rapidly increasing house prices if we put on controls through the government. And there are essentially two types of things you can do, one of which is to raise the loan-to-value ratio. That makes loans safer because it says, I have to put down a bigger down payment, and therefore I have more stake in the house, and therefore if the price falls, it's not so much of a problem for the lender. The second thing you can do is to control the safety of the borrower through what's called a debt-to-income ratio. And again, so what you then do is you say, if somebody's got a certain amount of income, they can only borrow up to a certain amount. Now, we do know that these do have an impact on housing, And obviously they've started to use these in cities. They're more usually not used in cities, but actually in regions.
Right.
So one thought would be, rather than saying Shenzhen, let's think about the province.
Right.
Yeah, can I
Well, these are just
interject?
financial
Yes.
tools we are talking about, Professor Liu. But once again, we are coming back to the two fundamental questions that I raised earlier, which is what's going to happen to a sunset sector like the real estate? And what is going to be the role of the government vis-a-vis the market when we see the real estate sector is, in a way, in its process of a new stage of development?
Well, can I offer a different opinion?
Please
I do
go
not
ahead.
think the real estate is really a sunsetting
Explain.
sector in China, because the urbanization process is still very strong, and also right now we have the migrating workers add up to more than 200 million, and most of them still they are renting houses.
But one thing, Professor, help us to explain
So there
to
is
our,
the
to our
real
viewers.
need.
But this
Yes.
is very important, because before, Chinese economy has been propped up when it comes to growth rate. A lot to do with how much investment the government is doing, and also about how much will these sectors, including real estate, be able to be encouraged by the government policies.
Yes.
And now we've seen those kind of policies cannot be sustainable. So these sectors have to see their own destiny rather than so-called being encouraged by certain governmental policies. So having said that, though, what would that mean for this sector? Of course, it's not going to be as glorious as it used to be. But what would the current realities mean for the real development of this area?
I think number one, I think there should be a clear line to be drawn between, the whether it is a commercial housing or whether it is really the sort of a government-backed economy housing. So Casa's work and God's work. So the government is doing God's work, so therefore they can subsidize, they can intervene into the market operation. But for commercial developments, I think the government really needs to have a hands-off to let the market play.
And Professor, you know this better than I do. Governments also very different. We talk about the national level, we also talk about the local level.
That's
the
a
local
very
level
critical
government,
point.
Yes, they want to sell the land, and also they get the tax from the real estate developers, and they can also sell these buildings. But on the other hand, national government is more concerned about the sustainability of the economy and its relations with the local government. Things are very complicated. Help us once again to explain.
I think the central government and local government, they have a common goal, but with different agenda, though. The central government, yes, look at the broader picture of the Chinese development, but local government are looking more also at the GDP increase, and also to pay the debt holes that is overburdening over their shoulder. So the land sales is the biggest pie that can really satisfy their hungry stomach.
Yeah.
But right now, in the lower tier cities, because of the ghost towns that are available, and also many of those developers are very small and fragile in terms of the financial capacity, so they are the one that is really struggling together with the local government. But I think during Li Keqiang's press conference recently, that I think the local government has some sort of relief, because the central government has promised to open its wallet to support the debt-ridden the local government. And so I think now the real estate development can also be something that is more on the positive road.
Mr. Bayomi, what do you think? Real estate sector, it used to be one of those pillars of China's GDP growth rate, but now it should be different. Will it be different? That is the real question.
Well, I think it will slow down somewhat, but there are three cross currents, all of which I think need to be taken into account. The first is that as a reaction to the financial crisis, the Chinese government let the banks go out and lend a lot of money, and quite a lot of that went into real estate, as banks are wont to do. So that was one thing which started a bit of a rise in house prices. The second thing, which is of course happening, is the move for the Chinese economy from being led by investment and exports to being much more led by consumption. Now that in some ways will help the real estate market, because you know, part of consumption is buying houses. Part of consumption is, you know, renting houses. The third thing which is happening is the deregulation of the financial system. Now that will mean that there are other options rather than buying houses. One of the reasons that house prices also started going up was that people had relatively few options. They could buy stocks, and as was mentioned, they've turned out to turn down lately. They could buy houses, or they could put it into deposits.
Right.
To the extent that they get more options, then maybe housing will get less of a sheen.
Before we go, Professor Liu, where are we heading for?
Well, I think this year there's going to be the corridor of price fluctuation of 20% for the first tier city. It's still going to surge up to 10%, and for the second and third tier city, it's going to fall by a margin of roughly 10%.
Well, every year we do analysis about China's real estate market. Every year there are different reasons behind it, and we'll see how things will evolve from here. Thank you so much, Professor Liu Baocheng here in Beijing with us, and Mr. Tamim Bayoumi from Washington, D.C. joining us from the Peterson Institute. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us. You can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.